Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. So in this video, we'll be recreating the bass sound from Skrillex and Fred Again's track Rumble. Here is the final result.
Jungle.
All right, so let's just jump right into it and get going. All right, so I'm pretty stoked with that remake. I think it's actually really close to the original, and we're gonna compare the two track here of Skrillex's song Rumble, which is this black track here, and then this white one is My Bounce. So you can see that we have a lot of similarity with what's going on with the waveform, because that means I basically am using similar sounds. Skrillex is just way better at mixing than I am generally. Not generally, always. And yeah, so I'm pretty stoked that I have this looking pretty darn close to his. Before we go any further, I do want to touch on a couple of the other sounds. I know some of you will probably ask in the comments how I made those. So let's quickly just run through those right now. So the pink section down here, this is my drum group, and we're going to start with the kick. So the kick is pretty simple. Right? You could use pretty much any type of kind of heavy, trappy kick. I did try a kick that had less high frequency content, and I noticed again, when I compared it to Skrillex's track, the actual waveform, that when the kick hit, there was some more kind of a grit to it. So we can see that this has some high frequency content, a little bit more, and you can see that there's the squared element. See how it looks like there's a square wave right here? Right there, there, and there. That's the actual kick, versus right here, we don't have a kick, so we don't see the square wave, right? You can clearly see the square wave happening when you get to the kick right there. So that's why I landed on this kick, because if we zoom in on this kick, you'll see, you guessed it, square wave. Now this kick is just a kick from our pack, Drums at Sauce. And yeah, so you could use any type of kick, but you can actually see when you do investigate the waveforms of the tracks you're trying to remake, or if you're trying to see like, well, what type of kick or snare they use, you can oftentimes see it in the actual waveform, which is pretty cool. Go to some of the other sounds here. The snare. Skrillex loved rims. He used a lot of rims in the his latest tracks, his album Quest for Fire specifically. So I just pulled up a rim, pitched it up, I think it was like 6 semitones, and that gives us what we have. So I could have spent a lot more time trying to find the exact rim, but I didn't. Then the hi-hats. Hi-hats are pretty simple. They're basically just some trap hi-hats. And because Skrillex uses Ableton, he used the auto pan to probably pan the hats left and right, because they do kind of bounce back and forth. Now, these last two pink tracks here, this one is actually a synth sound. That is that cool kind of little blip that happens every other snare. So cool sound, super easy to make. I'll quickly show you how to recreate that. Yeah, so basically you're gonna load up a sine or a triangle waveform. You could even do a square. You're just gonna have to filter more frequencies out, and it'll sound like this. Then you're going to turn on a low pass filter, turn the cutoff down quite a bit so you're not hearing a lot of the high frequency, especially if you're using like a triangle waveform. Right? Make sure your envelope kind of just decays like this, so you don't want a straight envelope, something like this with a lot of disdain. You want to have a natural decay, kind of like a pluck or a key sound. Then you're going to take a LFO shape that's good for vibrato, something like a sine wave, and modulate the fine pitch. That will give you the vibrato. And that's your sound. Water drop sound. So that is the drum section. Nothing too crazy. I will quickly go over this lead synth. This is kind of a pain to make, and I could have taken more time to do it. If you guys want to see that in a tutorial, let me know in the comments, and I'll consider posting that. But it sounds like this. All right, so now let's move on to what you're all here for, the bass sound in Rumble. So I think that Skrillex probably manipulated some type of sample, like a kick sample or a tom. And the reason for that is twofold. I got way closer manipulating a kick than I did working from a synth. Also, Skrillex in Quest for Fire made heavy use of percussive sounds in the drops. He used like a bongo for an entire drop. He just went off on kind of juxtaposing where you would assume a synth would be. He kind of was like, what happens if we use percussion? So that's why I kind of think with those two reasons in mind, it was probably a manipulated kick sample. That's just how I got closest. Now, I'm going to show you how to make this sound from scratch in a synth a little bit later in the video. But again, I think this sounds a little bit closer to the original. So the kick that I use sounds like this if I solo it. And that is with all the processing that you see here. Not to mention the processing on the master. So that being said, let's take a look at the actual original kick as it was. So here's the kick from one of our packs. It's called Squiggy. I'm not sure how I pronounce that. We'll drag that here. All right, so here is the kick as it was from the sample pack. So if I were to just recreate the same kind of 16th note pattern here. We'll solo this and we'll turn off some of the processing. You'll hear that this is going to sound wildly different. Right? It's just not even close. And it's not even as simple as just filtering out the highs. That kick's going to be too long. So basically what I wanted to do was I wanted to make sure that I was finding a sound that was tonally similar to what Skrillex used. And that actually took the most amount of time. What I did was I auditioned a few different, about 10 different kicks with FabFilter Pro Q3 on to see which one occupied the most space that was being occupied in Skrillex's low end of his track. And that was this one. And I thought, okay, let's try manipulating this. So that is the first step that I did, was just trying to get the tone right of the kick, because I didn't want to pitch it up and down in my DAW. I just wanted to leave it kind of more how the kick really was. Then I noticed that his didn't start right away. There's actually this kind of like faded out the end. And I then made sure that the cycles were kind of lining up with Skrillex's track. So you can see here, this track right here, and I'll color this real quick so you can see the difference. This pink one now, you can see that it's the same sample, right? But it's not lining up. So what's going on with that? Well, what I did was, to get the tonality more similar to Skrillex's, I made sure I had the warp mode on, and then I went into the end of the kick after I made my pattern, my 16th note pattern. I highlighted the kick, hit Command and Shift, and then your cursor turns into this weird little bracket with an arrow. And then I just actually shrunk the kick until I got something that looked similar to what Skrillex had. Now, this made the kick a little bit tighter, and it kind of made the kick have the right tone, right? So I just lined this up next to Skrillex's and went for it. And then I did the fades and then made the pattern. So now that we got that out of the way, let's go to the next step of the process here. So let's just mute this track here and we'll just minimize it. So the correct one that we're working with, I'll recolor to pink so you guys can see and understand what's going on. So it's this pink one now. All right, so the next thing I did was turned everything to mono, and then it is the bulk of the processing, which is EQ. Looks like the first EQ looks like this. Taking out all the highs, have a notch filter in the mids, and yeah, just trying to get it to have that low rumble. Then I have a utility adding a little bit of gain that I lost from the EQing. Then I am running that into a glue compressor. And then that's going to another instance of the FabFilter Pro Q3 to further clean it up, and that's the final sound that we get, right, for the bass. Now, the bass in Skrillex's track is not just a low-end sound. Again, he loved using percussion in a lot of what he did with Quest for Fire. All right, so basically what I did was I just layered a couple perks together, and it was a kind of a hit and miss trial by error to get something that was close. I used a bongo and a timbale and then something with a little bit of transient. And then what I did was I just kind of, I actually changed the pitch a couple different hits to get that ticka, right? A little bit of different velocity by turning down the gain. So then layering those two sounds together, you get a close approximation of what I think happens in the track. All right, so now let's look at how you can create a similar sound all from scratch in a synth like Serum. So as opposed to using the kick method I just showed you. So here is the drop with the Serum version. All right, so let's look at what's going on. So a fair bit of processing after the synth. I'm going to turn that off for now so you guys can hear exactly what's going on directly in Serum as we go through this sound. So pretty simple sound. I'm going to change the skin here. All right, there we go. Serum's looking nice now. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off and kind of just deconstruct this sound. So we're going to bypass all of the destinations here and bypass that and turn that off. So basically, you're going to want to start with a waveform that you can ultimately filter down to a bass, like a sub bass, right? Something that's just low. And that could be a sine wave, a triangle wave, or a square wave. So I'm using this wave. And the first thing you're going to do is pencil in your pattern. So if you want to get the same type of pattern, just a 16th note pattern. Then you're going to pitch that down -3 octaves, and you can mess around with the semitone depending on the key of the track that you're working on, and you'll get a different tone. All right, then you're going to make sure that your envelope shape is super short and plucky. Something like that. So you don't have, and a short release, so you don't have a lot of buildup with the actual quick succession of the notes in the pattern. Now we're going to turn on the filter. We're going to go to an LFO. We're going to create a shape like this, set to a 16th note. Make sure you have trigger on. Then you're going to modulate. You're going to modulate the cutoff of your filter. And that's going to start to give it that kind of knocking vibe. Now, changing the wavetail position, adding a warp mode will definitely change the tonality, even changing the waveform, of course, and even changing where you set your cutoff to. So mess around with the resonance, the drive, and the fat to get different tones. Now, the next thing I did was I added a little ramp up on my bend just to have the sound change over time. I thought that's what I heard going on in Skrillex's version, but I could just be making it up. Now, you can layer in another sound with that. You can mess around with these attack kicks in Serum. That one's kind of cool. And there are a bunch of them. You can actually use this as your building block for the sound, but you can, of course, layer it with your main sound to get more oomph to it. Now, this is just being ran into an EQ, another low-pass filter taking out some more highs, and a simple distortion, a tube distortion in Serum. Right, just to beef it up, nothing crazy. Outside of Serum, I'm running it into a utility with bass set to mono. Then I'm running it into FabFilter Pro Q3. And that's taking out the highs. And then we are running that into a glue compressor, just to tighten things up, utility to make up for the lost gain, and another EQ that looks like this. And that gets us back closer to the sound of the initial bass I made with the kick. So if we listen again in context. Jungle. So it's a little quiet right now, and I'd have to mix that, but that is the general idea. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, if you guys want to download a few basses that I made like this, there'll be a link in the description, no download gate, just hit the link and you're off and running. But yeah, that is how I think you can recreate a sound that is really similar to Skrillex Fred Again's track, Rumble. And yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. I will end this playing the track. Jungle.